Well, welcome everyone to this session tonight. I am Robert P. Jones. I'm the CEO and founder of PRRI, and I'll be your host this evening. And just want to officially welcome you to our panel discussion entitled Christians Against Christianity, a conversation with Oberem Hendrix Jr., Alicia, Sharon, Harper, myself, and Jim Wallace. And I'm really looking forward to what's sure to be a provocative and wide-ranging discussion. It's going to be centered around Obery's new book, Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. So tonight we'll be moving through the panel discussion portion of the evening till around 7:50, and then we'll be turning to questions from all of you who are participating until about 8:15 or so, when we'll begin wrapping up. If you have a question, please feel free to put it at any time starting now in the Q&A session. It will come to us, and I will be reviewing those and serving those up when we get to that portion of the discussion. Say a little bit more about Obery in a minute. I'll save him for last, but I want to do a brief introduction to our distinguished panel. We'll have some more extensive bios for everyone in the chat, so I'm just going to give the briefest introductions here. These are all actually, public theologians here, each with their prophetic witnesses over the years in their own rights. And I'm happy to call each of them friends, colleagues, and fellow travelers. I'm really excited to be a part of this this evening. So first, we have Alicia Sharon Harper. She is a writer, public theologian, and activist, and president and founder of Freedom Road, which is an innovative consulting group that crafts experiences that bring common understanding and common commitments that lead to common action toward a more just world. Next, we have Reverend Jim Wallace. He is I have a new title to read for him. He is the inaugural holder of the Endowed Chair in Faith and Justice and the founding director of the Georgetown University Center on Faith and Justice. And as we know, also the founder of Sojourners. So welcome, Jim, with your new hat on. And then last, but certainly not least, the scholar whose work we're here to talk about tonight is Oberem Hendrix Jr. He is an activist, a religious scholar, and of course the author of the book, Christians Against Christianity, which we're talking about tonight. Obery is, I've known Obery a long time now, longer than I want to admit, maybe to date me, but he is one of the foremost commentators at the intersection of religion and political economy in the country. He's the most widely read, perhaps the most influential African-American biblical scholar writing today. His recent book we're talking about hasn't been out long, but has already gathered really wide acclaim. Cornel West has called him one of the last few grand prophetic intellectuals. So that's where the bar is tonight, Obery, just so you know. He's got a really eclectic background. He's a former Wall Street investment executive, past seminary president at Payne Theological Seminary, which is the oldest African-American theological seminary in the US. He's currently a visiting scholar at Columbia University in the Department of Religion and the Department of African-American and African Diasporic Studies. And he's a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary and an emeritus professor of biblical interpretation at New York Theological Seminary. In addition to all of that, he is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, holds a Master of Divinity from Princeton, an MA and PhD in religions of late antiquity from Princeton. And Obery, I'm going to start by just reading something that I got to write about the book. I had the privilege of writing a blurb about the book. I thought I'd just read that. It's kind of my segue toward our conversation before handing it over to you to let you write a few things, because I think it gives what I was struck with when I had a chance to read an advanced copy of the book. And here's what kind of came to me. It's a sign of our unsettling times when a figure like Oberem Hendrix Jr., respected biblical scholar, former seminary president, and elder in the church, calls on his fellow Christians to rise up against much of what contemporary Christianity has become. Christians Against Christianity is a searing indictment of white evangelicals' allegiance to white supremacy and political power, and a clarion call to all Christians to go back to the Bible, to reclaim a faith rooted in love and responsibility for others rather than domination and self-interest. This is a must-read book for this crucial moment in our nation's history. So Obery, with that, you're a biblical scholar by training. And as we all know, we all only have so many books in us in a lifetime. So, what was it? Why this book, and why now? What really, pushed you to write about this book? And maybe you could also, if part of that is, you could maybe find a excerpt to share with us. That would be great. And along the way, maybe you could say a little bit about, this term that's that runs through the book, right-wing evangelicalism, so we can kind of make sure we're understanding what you mean by that term.
Okay.
As we talk tonight.
Well, thank you, Robbie. I'd like to thank you and PRRI for the really the honor of sponsoring this. It's an organization I've watched grow and had some hand with.
I completely forgot to put that in your bio, Obery. Yeah, longstanding board member at PRRI. Make sure we got that on the table.
Yeah. But I've watched you grow it from a one-room office up into one of the powerhouses of the resource information field in the United States. And so I'm very honored that you've taken the time to do this. Also honored by my two colleagues who I respect greatly and have known for some time and have watched, who are brilliant freedom fighters, but also brilliant thinkers and writers. Alicia, Sharon, Harper, and Jim Wallace. I'm just so honored that you think enough of me to do this. I must say, and Jim Wallace published my first published piece, which he wouldn't even remember, back in the 90s. I think it was in the early days of Sojourner, but it was certainly my early days. I wrote a review of Kane Felder's book, Troubling Biblical Waters. It was like half a page long. And Jim wrote in response, "I was jazzed by your review," to give everybody a sense of the time period. So I want to thank you all very much. These are terrible times. And I must say that I was moved with a sense of sadness, equal sense of sadness and anger and outrage at what right-wing evangelicals are doing to this country, to write this book. And when I say right-wing evangelicals, I'm being very specific, because evangelicalism is a fine old tradition that has in years past been progressive on many fronts. But right-wing evangelicalism is an evangelicalism that is in the thrall of right-wing politics. I also would say it's more ideological Christianity than it is doctrinal or faith Christianity. Ideological in the sense that right-wing evangelicalism it focuses and refracts its Christianity through the prism of their own interests and ideologies, which allows them to turn their back on, to ignore biblical teachings that do not serve their interests. And they're libertarian in the sense that they believe that the most important aspect of Christianity is freedom, which is just bass backward. It's responsibility for our neighbors. And so, also I'd say that we have to include in that definition today, being in thrall of a very destructive, sick sociopath, pathological liar in the form of Donald Trump, whom so many of them, some of their leaders have actually called a Messiah, and some, like Sheldon Adelson's wife, the late Republican financier and Las Vegas mogul, she said that one day she would hope there'd be a book of Trump in the Bible. So, we're talking about a move that is just not a movement that is the antithesis of the gospel, and also in the sense that they don't mention love. You never hear them talk about loving neighbor. You never hear them talk about justice. If it's anything, it's just us, concerned for themselves. There were some other aspects of what you asked me, but I hope I addressed the main points that you asked. And I,
Yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, did you have a section you wanted to read just to kind of give us a flavor of?
Well, yeah, I will. I'll read some passages from the epilogue, and I'll jump around a little bit in it, so don't worry if it doesn't sound like it's has continuity. Early in the book, I talk about the early evangelicals, how the abolitionists of slavery were evangelicals, and all their social concerns that they were involved with, and even concerned with labor issues and supporting unions and all of that. And also, I do mention in the book my two colleagues, Alicia, Sharon Harper and Jim Wallace, who are also evangelicals. You know, they are certainly not right wing, you know, which I don't say you can be a right wing evangelical and really be in tune with the gospel anyway. But anyway, so I just want to explain that as I begin. We have seen how seriously then so many of America's early evangelicals embraced the community affirming commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. So seriously, in fact, that it inspired them to actively oppose chattel slavery, to organize to offer succor to the needy, and to decry the economic exploitation of the masses. So how then has the love-affirming evangelicalism of the past become today's forward legion of division and exclusion? A raging Christian faction openly supporting persons and policies that are essentially antithetical to the message of Jesus Christ? I believe in answers offered by the very Bible that evangelicals profess to live by. The answer is this: they have succumbed to what the first epistle of John in the New Testament calls the spirit of Antichrist. Now, when I speak of a spirit of Antichrist, I'm not talking about a monstrous supernatural being like the beast in the book of Revelation, which, by the way, never mentions an Antichrist, or a man of law, or the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians, or the murderous, manipulative figure found in popular media like Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series, or horror movies like The Omen. In fact, I'm not talking about a singular figure at all. 1 John uses both Antichrist and Antichrist plural. What I'm talking about are ideologies and public pronouncements that cynically distort the teachings of Christ in the name of Christ to serve the selfish interests of a particular individual or group. This is reflected in John's identification of a spirit in 1 John, not from God, which is the spirit of the Antichrist, which he says is the motivating force of Antichrist, by which the writer meant those who falsely portrayed the nature of Jesus and thus also the nature of his mission in the world. 1 John waxes tenderly about loving others and experiencing spiritual communion with God. It also offers several admonitions. Perhaps the most significant is to beware of false teachings. I write these things to you, it says, concerning those who would deceive you. The primary false teaching the letter is concerned with is what has come to be called the Dosetic Heresy. This heresy held that Jesus was not a being of flesh and blood. Instead, its adherents asserted, Jesus was a phantasm who only seemed to have an earthly body, from dokein in the Greek, to seem, which was the conclusion of those who couldn't accept that the one they thought to be their victorious deliverer from worldly oppression instead died a humiliating, ignominious human death at the hands of the world. This docetic notion of Jesus' crucifixion presented a challenge to the very foundations of the nascent Christian faith, because if it was only a phantasm of Jesus that was crucified, if it only seemed that Jesus himself had been crucified, then he did not die on the cross to atone for the sins of the world. Furthermore, the docetic rejection of Jesus' full humanity were to prevail, there was the real danger that it would mean the demise of the budding Christian faith. Yet John's letter reflects that his main fear was not that those outside the community of Christ's believers would use the docetic heresy to attack the faith. He realized that the real danger to the faith was the misleading ideas spread by his fellow believers. As far as John was concerned, those who circulated distortions of the foundational truths of the faith, even those among his fellow Christ worshipers, were antichrists, opponents of Christ, possessed by a spirit of Antichrist. I believe that like those the writer of First John railed against in his day, today's right-wing evangelicals are also imbued with the spirit of Antichrist that has them trafficked in another kind of Dosetic heresy, one that dismisses an illusory and phantasmic the aspects of the gospel that do not suit their dominationist agenda. Like true Docetists, they would have us believe that the social justice imperative of the Bible, its command to offer hospitality to immigrants, and the political radicality of Jesus and this commandment to love your neighbor as yourself are not what they seem, that they are instead figments of a mistaken biblical imagination or the product of seduction by Satan and his liberal emissaries. It is the spirit of Antichrist and the Dosetic heresy it has weaponized that have possessed right-wing evangelicals to support and even lead assaults on truth and decency, to co-sign expressions of hate rather than striving to spread love, to spew spiteful invective against other faiths rather than accepting them as fellow children of God, and most appallingly, to extol Donald Trump as God's chosen vessel in the highest corridors of earthly power, even as his malevolent words and deeds dishonored God by sowing chaos and deadly disunion among us. Rather than striving to build harmony, they applauded the construction of spiteful walls of division. Rather than standing on moral consistency, they offered shameless excuses for the rankest of hypocrisies. Rather than suing for peace, they embraced the death-dealing agenda of the NRA. Rather than spreading gospel affection, they demonize Muslims and liberals and accuse those who question their machinations as being part of absurd, murderous conspiracies. It is because of the spirit of Antichrist that dominating American society is now more important to right-wing evangelicals than maintaining the integrity of the Christian gospel. More important than honesty or love or care for those who look for them for truth, more important than honesty or love or care for those who look to them for truthful guidance and nurturance. In God's name, they had visited upon our nation a plague of lies, a harvest of hate, the rotted fruit of unchecked corruption and moral chaos, and unleashed levels of racial antipathy and xenophobia that untold numbers of lovers of God and humanity had labored and died to keep from ever again seeing the light of day. Not only is their worldview not loving, not generous, not socially inclusive, but the notion of religious freedom they so extol extends no farther than their own ranks. They have so savaged the social justice legacy of their evangelical forebears that it is now unrecognizable. I'll leave it there. I think that that gives a sense of sense of what I mean by right-wing evangelicals, I believe, who have really given up their moral claim to any kind of leadership in the body of Christ, and also in the body politic.
Well, I think we just need to leave a full stop there and take a breath for a minute. That's quite a testimony, quite a sermon. Lisa, why don't I turn the platform to you next?
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you, Obery, for, first of all, for that beautiful reading, but also for this incredibly powerful book. I swear, as I was reading it, all I could think was, thank you. Somebody has spoken the words. Somebody has said the words. They wrote it down. And I just want to say thank you. I'm really struck by your contextualization. And I think that is what separates you from the many biblical scholars that are out there. I'm sure obviously there are others, but you as a Black man in America today, of your generation, you begin by placing us in the context of your family and your family's faith. And I think that is incredibly important. I think that, first of all, I love how first of all, your writing is amazing. It's incredibly beautiful. And all I could think to myself was, wow, he's actually a good writer. Like, this isn't just good theology or good biblical interpretation. This is really great writing. So I wanted to say thank you for that. Your grandmother's name, Willie Bell, I'm sorry, Beatrice, reminds me of my grandmother's.
That's my mother's name.
Oh, your mother,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Your
right.
mother's name, Willie Beatrice, reminds me of my grandmother's name, Willie Bell. And they used to call her Mom Billy as well. They call her Mom Billy.
Mhm.
So it made me think, I wonder if we're related. That has to do with my next book, which is family history. I'm just all up in that, right?
Mhm.
So I resonate completely with your words in your introduction. I think I was really captured by the introduction. The contours of this venerable faith are barely recognizable. When you were talking about the religious right, and in particular, this far right contingency, the faith of my forebears is offended. I am offended. I believe the gospel itself is offended. All of this in the introduction, that I really appreciated, because you spoke the words, and you showed us, I think in many ways, this is probably how Brown Jesus feels about his own faith, the faith that purports to follow him, but actually bears no resemblance. You said on page X5I, I was like 16 in the introduction, any study of the Bible that does not engage the writings in their respective historical and cultural contexts is at best incomplete, if not fatally misleading. And I think that that's one of the most important things you've said. And your introduction reminds me of the way that Luke opens his gospel. He endeavors to set the record straight, and you actually say that at the end of your intro. I endeavor to set the record straight. But you don't do that in the way that we are taught in the academy, which is, and really, and throughout modern thought, which is to pluck things from their context and then examine them in a petri dish and think you've got it. But what and I don't know if it's an innovation as much as it's something you've absolutely mastered and have taught me. I realize, even reading this book, how much the politics of Jesus influences the way that I do theology, the way that I actually read the scripture now. But you are always placing it in the political and cultural and historical geopolitical context. And that is what makes the difference. So here's my question to you. When you talk about early in the book about Genesis, about dominion, and how dominion has been misinterpreted by the right-wing evangelicals. In the Very Good Gospel, I spent a whole long chapter on dominion and how it's been misinterpreted, and how actually the writer or writers of Genesis 1 what they were doing was democratizing power, throwing power out to all humanity, not actually hoarding it only for those who would dominate. But in the academy itself, it seems that the interpretations of scripture have been dominated by Europe, by the halls of empire and the academy of Europe, and then translated over to America, but basically Europeans in America. And I wonder what you believe. What is the responsibility that systematic theology or normative acontextual biblical interpretation bear in bringing us, the church and the nation, to the place where it is right now?
Yeah, no, that's very important. Some of being trained as a biblical scholar, part of the training, any decent training, is to always look at the historical context, right? So that's just a benefit of my training. All biblical scholars all decent biblical scholars should be trained that way, right?
But I will just say, Obery, yes, they should. But why then is it the case that most political context is not taken seriously, even as they do?
Yeah, well, a lot of it has to do with perspective. I mean, those from my social location, your social location, we bring a different angle of vision, to it. I mean, the reason I talk about my parents, my grandparents, my family, and the kind of gospel that I was raised in, that we raised in, the humanity of and the love and the sense of reciprocity. That's, for instance, it was so easy for me to understand the moral economy of the peasantry that underlies the Gospels, because the two aspects of the two dimensions of the moral economy of the peasants are reciprocity and recognizing a right of subsistence, that everyone has a right of subsistence. And this reciprocity, if I do for you, I don't have to worry about it because I know you'll do for me when I need it. Well, I saw that, so many of us saw that. People from the South see it, black and white, and then it's so very important in Black society. So, a lot of it's perspectival. And the reason why my purview is so political, because I'm a biblical scholar. I'm actually written a political book when you think about it, but it's because of my social location, right?
Yeah.
Growing up in the 60s and growing up in the Black nationalist movement and seeing all being conscientized by all the things that we saw that the FBI was doing and all of that. And so, I'm able to bring all of that to it. And the other thing is, I've got to, those of us who do this kind of approach that I take, I'll speak for myself. I'm serious about this. For me, it's life and death. And for so many people, it's just it's just an academic exercise, or it's the way they rise up in their church or their denomination. For me, it's life and death. So, so I have to take the gospel seriously. I have to take loving your neighbor seriously, and all of that implies, and I have to look at the setting of the Gospels, which is what my primary work is, to see to listen to see what kind of correspondences there might be, relative correspondences with what's going on today. I have to do. So many scholars don't have to do that, or they're not concerned to do that. You see what I'm saying? It's life or death for me, and I've never really said that publicly, but that's the way that I see it. I'll really quickly. I came down with Lyme disease really badly when I was in seminary, and I was taking summer Hebrew, which was very, very intense, 8 hours a day, and I was so sick that they asked me to withdraw from school. And I remember saying, but I can't. I think if I withdraw, I'll die. I feel like as sick as I was, I was sick, man. I'm telling you, so in retrospect, I realize now that that's what it's about, because it was never in my plan to be a biblical scholar. I was on Wall Street, man. I was looking to be rich, So I hope that answers your response to what you're saying. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Obery. Jim?
Let me just pick up on where this conversation is going. Obery, you always have a wonderful sense of timing. Timing. And this book is, as we would say, right on time for what we're facing right now. The hour before this, I was on a call with our mutual friend, Barbara Williams Skinner, and this call was mostly AME leaders, your own denomination, your new bishop.
Francine Brookins, yes, my friend.
Well, she was on the call, and Bishop Richardson now has moved to Texas.
Good man.
And he heard Freddie Haynes talk about how Texas has become the apex of the voting rights struggle. And the plan for this next 2 weeks is a march to nationalize what's happening in Texas. And let me just say what some of us are trying to say to even the White House, which is saying many of the right things about this, they don't seem to understand that everything is at stake.
Mm.
When you say life and death, that's not hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
The last election wasn't stolen, but the next two are planned to be.
Yes.
Planned to be strategically.
Mm-hmm.
So your wonderful scholarship highlights where we are right now, because right-wing evangelicals use that term. Let's say right-wing white evangelicals, because that's what
Well, yeah,
is leading this.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't sort of create itself out of a bad theological conference at Wheaton College. There were political operatives from the Republican Party who, as political operatives, created what we now call the religious right. That's the untold story. It wasn't some theological thing gone wrong. It was operatives who came in and turned the evangelical tradition into a right-wing political movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a political movement.
Yeah.
And that political movement is now being politicized to, in fact, create a campaign which I would call, not only is it Antichrist, it's an assault on Imago Dei, the first book in the first chapter of Genesis, which Lisa has written about so much. Let us create them, says God, in our own image and likeness.
Mm-hmm.
So they might have dominion, in the word, as she points out, means stewardship, together of the rest of creation. Instead, one people decides to have dominion over other people, which is an assault on Imago Dei, a throwing away of Imago Dei. And what that means is preventing a multiracial democracy in this country. That's what's at stake.
Imago Dei, image of God, yes. Mm-hmm.
Imago Dei, image of God. So this, our new campaign we're putting together is faiths, plural, united to save democracy.
Mm-hmm.
You could call it the Imago Dei campaign.
Mm.
But your book is the theological underpinning for all that, because as you point out, this isn't a political issue, a partisan issue, a Republican, Democrat. This is a theological issue. Your wonderful book, which I also recommend, The Politics of Jesus, talked about how Jesus wasn't political in the ways that our ideological politics are, but everything he said and did, as you point out again in this book about love your neighbor, and Jesus says, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free, which means if you don't know the truth, you're in bondage.
Mm-hmm.
So a whole bunch of people, white people in this country, who believe what's called the disinformation, let's call it the lie culture, are in bondage.
Mm-hmm.
And your book is how to set them free by going back to Jesus.
Mm.
And so white evangelicals have been politicized by a movement that is trying to prevent changing demography from changing democracy.
Mm.
That's what they're trying to do on every level. And there's an energy deficit on the liberal left side.
Yeah, yeah.
Democratic Party. The energy is all on the right.
Yeah.
They're organized in we're in 10 states now. They are organized to win these restrictive election laws in state legislatures, which the system is skewed to make that inevitable.
Yeah, right.
Like Freddie Haynes said today, we don't have the votes in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
The system is structured so you'll never have the votes in state legislatures.
Yeah.
And in Washington, you've got Republicans who are going to vote against any voting rights legislation. So your book is a theological, I want to recommend it to people, as you'll see all these news reports about voting rights and voting reform and all this as politics and partisan. No, it's theological.
Mm-hmm.
And you're showing how it's the It's the assault on the gospel that has occurred here. And the only way to get out of this is to go back to that earlier evangelical tradition, which we would all identify with, which was about, I mean, Jesus' opening gig is Nazareth Manifesto in Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news, and the word there is evangel, good news, to the poor, which means any gospel that is not good news to poor people isn't the gospel of Jesus, clearly and simply.
Right.
Now, we've all three said that before, but this is a moment where existentially everything is at stake, and they're trying to prevent democracy, real multiracial from happening.
Right.
And you're pointing out this is isn't just a political thing and we mount political movements. This is deeply theological.
Yeah.
And our faith is being tested here, not just our politics,
Yeah.
but our faith. Because a whole lot of young people, if the church doesn't stand against this, they're gonna leave the church and never come back.
Yeah, and rightly so, Jim. You know, man, so you raised interesting points, but I like to say I like to say it's even more than a theological issue. If we look at the fact that Jesus taught, and I'm talking about Jesus because we're talking about Christianity right now, but Jesus really taught not much about what to believe, right? He taught ethics. He taught how to act. In fact, you know, you pointed, what was that big book you had? The big bestseller book.
God's Politics. God's Politics.
Yeah, what a great book. So to me, underlying it's really a moral and an ethical issue, right? Which is how I tried to frame it in the book, because you know, one can be influenced by and even influenced by and even guided by teachings of Jesus. You don't even really have to believe that Jesus was any more than a teacher. I'm not saying that he was not, that he was only that, but there are those who aren't going to be Christians. But one doesn't have to be that to see the value of these teachings, and that's why, as you know, for me, it's a matter of misinterpretation, misrepresentation of the Bible, which is why I took such pains, right? Like with social justice, and to smack John MacArthur around, I took such pains to do that, because because the basic issue is that they misappropriate the Bible in service to evil ends. And I would like to, and you know, you pointed out about the origin of right-wing evangelicalism, so important. They Randy Balmer pointed that out, right? That they came together in it was about 80, was it, or so?
Yep, 1980.
And these top evangelical leaders came together to decide what issues they were going to use to coalesce around to help them on their road to dominate all of American society, right? And it's so obvious. So they chose homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and abortion. When the Southern Baptist Convention, as Robbie points out in his book, the Southern Baptist Convention had supported Roe versus Wade, right? So yeah, it's really crazy. It's really crazy. I appreciate your comments, man. You know, you're right on. Mm-hmm.
I think Obery, well, Lisa, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, actually, I want to know, is it appropriate to kind of get into conversation now? Because
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So, Obery, I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me, even from what you were just saying in your conversation with Jim, is, I mean, really going back to this contextualization question, because I understand that biblical scholars, that's what they do, but your social location has led you to see things that others haven't seen. And I am actually still left with the question, what responsibility does the practice that systematic theology does, which is to lift things from their context, to see if they work in a petri dish. And if they do, then it's true, versus seeing everything in its context and understanding that the Bible is particular, that these stories are particular and have particular meaning, not just generic meaning. What responsibility does that bear for where we find ourselves right now with the religious right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So systematic theology, as you point out, they systematize,
Mm-hmm.
right, the faith into various categories. I'm not a systematic theologian because I felt that there was more that needed to be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, responsibility, and I'm not, I hope I get the gist of your question, but the responsibility that we have is, I think, if we really want to be informed by the gospel message in an empowering way that empowers us and shows us how we can build a world around loving our neighbors as ourselves, meaning a world of egalitarian justice, meaning we want the same opportunities and rights and access to the good things of life for our neighbors as we want for ourselves. If we really want to do it, I think we have to really go back and try to understand what he was teaching, what it meant in his context, what it meant to those he was talking to at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, for instance, when we look at the Lord's Prayer, something as basic as the Lord's Prayer, and we put it in context, my God, how radical that is, really, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't seen that unpacked a lot outside of biblical studies, where it's not unpacked much, either. I mean, I'm not the first one to do it.
Right.
Well, without doubt. But it's not done often. But it's, again, it comes down to the perspective that they don't look at these people as broke, beaten down, oppressed peasants who are beaten down by the temple ideology that says that the religious establishment takes priority and has a higher status in the household of God, and so they can't make the kinds of they can't come up with the same kinds of correlations that one might, like when we look at the woman, the widow's mite in Mark 14, and that wonderful that's supposed to be that this woman gave her last. Well, you look at it context, Jesus can't be saying that's a great thing. You say that's horrible. You have, the temple, you rich guys in the temple, you're living large, and you have, and you're purveying this ideology among the people such that a poor widow would give everything that she has and doesn't have anything left to buy food with. This is horrible. But if you don't have the kind of clear perspective, you won't see that, right?
Wow.
And that's why, people like yourself and Jim and all those who are, really functioning on the forefront, bring the kind of perspective that brings these things to life, and I'm trying to build on the shoulders of folk who come before. I go beyond some of them because I'm of another generation. Also, I have different experiences.
Right.
I was a revolutionary. I was a street soldier, and in the Black Cultural Nationalist movement. So I bring another thing to it.
So picking up on what Lisa just said about context and what you said about who Jesus was speaking to and the historical context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to me that his very last talk, his speech, his last gig was Matthew 25. His last speech before he went into Jerusalem, in which is the most judgmental of all of his teachings.
Yep.
That sheep and goats, and you either listen or you're going to heaven or hell. It's very unlike Jesus is not judgmental. Well, he was in that text.
And I do that throughout the book. That's a thread I use.
You do throughout the book. And that was my conversion text, that Matthew 25 passage, which brought me out of the student movement to my faith in Christ, or back to my faith in Christ. And it was me passage, you know. I was hungry. That was me. I was thirsty. What does that mean? I was a mom in Flint, and my kids couldn't drink the water because it was full of lead. I was thirsty, you know. I was naked. Well, we were stripped of everything in Guatemala because of climate change. We couldn't grow any food. And then they came after my daughter and my son. And so we came to America to seek asylum. And then we got taken away from our kids and put in cages. Jesus, that was me. I was a stranger. It was me. And as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Then he goes into Jerusalem. And where does he go first? What you just said, the temple. The temple, which was the archetype of faith and politics in that time, and he's turning everything over, including the tables in the temple. So he's turning over our political priorities in that text in Matthew 25. And in my mission statement of this Georgetown thing, I said, we're going to make Matthew 25 operative in terms of policy priorities. That's what a center on faith and justice does.
That's exactly what I said in the book. Yes, exactly.
That you did. And then he overturns the tables right there. So this is, and what Lisa said about location, Brian Stevenson talks so much about proximity. Because in fact, even white liberal progressive folk, even if the right-wing evangelicals help this new, well, it's fascistic, this new fascistic regime come to being, most white progressives benefit from Donald Trump's tax cuts, you know, whereas people who are on the bottom, it is life and death we're talking about here. If they overturn our elections and take over the country, it is life and death for low income, especially low income people of color. So this is, and when bringing Robbie into this, Robbie's written powerful books about, is this church just too white? Too white. I mean, it's just too white. And I think we're looking at a situation where we're going to get, at best, a remnant white church, which will be a minority of white Christians who join with church leaders, Black and brown church leaders, to create literally a new American church that looks like the rest of the body of Christ around the world. But most white Christians aren't going there. So those who are white listening to this thing, this isn't just being on the right side of issues. This is dissenting. This is becoming a remnant, joining with the leadership of Black and brown Christians to create literally a new church in this country, which could help us navigate our way to a multiracial democracy.
May I say,
that's what's at stake.
Yeah, thank you, brother. No, those are such important observations, But I want to pivot to Robbie's last two books, but this recent book, most recent book, White Too Long, brilliant book. I use it in this book as well. He talks about the problems, the rotten foundations of so much of American Christendom. And I must say that I am not concerned. My main concern is not the church and continuity of the church. It really is putting into practice those things that we believe in and that you have been striving for decades, Jim, the kind of justice in the world and all that. And I don't know what role the church is going to play in that. I do know that if we uphold, the ethical foundations of the faith, for instance, we know that justice is the most used ethical concept in the whole Bible. If mishpat, for instance, if we hold that up and talk about that, there are a lot of people who would coalesce with us, right? And who are who do not want to get involved in so many of the problems in the hierarchy in the church. So I guess because I'm a biblical scholar, I'm just concerned about what the text says and what it tells us we can do. I'm not, and maybe it sounds heretical, but I'm not that concerned about the church. The church will come along, or it won't. And Robbie pointed a lot of that out in his book. How folk, the attitudes of folk toward the church is like they'll choose their church over the Bible, over justice, right? If their church doesn't believe in justice, well, damn the Bible, go with justice, right, Robbie?
Yeah, well, amen. I think that's where we're struggling with. I think that is what the gift that this book has given them. As I'm hearing you talk, Obery, I'm realizing that so many of the conversations that are about social justice, so many of the conversations that are about equality, these kind of deep democratic values, don't have nearly as many Bible verses quoted when those conversations are happening. And I think one of the real gifts you've given us here is someone who is so deeply just grounded, right, in the Bible. And like you said, thinking about the Bible and what, going back to the Bible. What is the Bible? I mean, those are things that I heard in my, evangelical Southern upbringing. Let's go back to the Bible, and the stuff you're talking about, like understanding the Bible in context. I mean, that's stuff I heard in my very conservative evangelical Southern Baptist seminary, right? But it led to some different places. But I just appreciate you being able to speak that language and kind of not give it up, right? I think that's what often happens. It gets seeded, right? And you're holding it and saying, no, actually, the ties here are stronger than those claims, right? And I think that's the real gift in many ways of this book. And just hearing you talk, I'm reminded of that. I want to turn a little bit to, we have some questions coming in, and we've got one right up top here that I think is a good. We mentioned Texas already. The other thing that has been in the news with Texas is a Senate bill that is about education, and this has been happening all over the country, right? And it's a really odd thing that in 2021 we are having a tug of war in a bill between a party that feels the need to actually insert into a bill that the history of white supremacy is morally wrong, right? So and then there's tug of war, and then another party stripping out that language. So I'm not sure what I'm more disturbed by, the fact that one party feels the need to put into a bill that white supremacy is wrong, or the other party stripping it out, right? I mean, both of those things are a disturbing testimony to where we are, I think, in the country. And then we have a question that's from an experience of a right on the ground. I'll just read it. It says, I serve on a local school board where we're continually having Christians coming to tell us that we're selling out to Marxist ideology. There are several of us on the board in the school administration who are all Christ followers who want to help people love others well. Do you have any insight on how to kindly stay on mission while not getting distracted and letting our community get distracted by this hate? Yes, maybe a little bit, Obery, like what's going on there with this fight over history and this fight over being able to say that white supremacy is bad. And the other thing that bill does, by the way, is strips out Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail as recommended teaching. So what's happening with 2021, right? We got Martin Luther King's birthday as a federal holiday. What's going on?
It's again, this Pandora's box of hatred has been opened. In some ways, Trump was a major, catalyst, a major part of that. He spearheaded it in many ways. And what we're hearing, what's coming out is what's been there all the time. I think, it hasn't been chic for some time or acceptable polite company to shout out racist stuff, but it is now. And what it also, I think what it also reveals is the deep, as you talk about in your book, Robbie, the deep racism of these right-wing evangelicals, right? They don't want to, they want to maintain as much of a privileged position in society as they can. And anything that questions that, they demonize, right? But it comes down, it just comes down to white supremacist control, of society. They don't even, they barely want to acknowledge the long legacy of slavery here. But so much of that comes down to the fact, like what I tried to deal with in the book is to point out the fallacies in what they're saying, as opposed to the book they claim guides them, and the person who asked the question and pointed out their experience, well, I wrote the book, in a way to give a resource to push back on these folk. My chapter on knowing Jesus, I forgot what I call it. It's what it's called here. Who do you say that I am? Right-wing evangelicals, dangerous misappropriations of Jesus. I try to point out the basic stuff about his message, man, but also to point out the centrality, and I take pains to show that, as you know, in the book, to show the centrality of social justice, egalitarian social justice, as the foundational ethic of the Bible. And it's there's no question about it. So if one can push back and say, well, wait, is this consistent though with this notion of egalitarian justice? Is this consistent with loving neighbor as yourself? That gives us a basis for some kind of conversation, but we do have to go back to the biblical text, because supposedly our faith is grounded in that. So that's how I would respond, on first phase.
Right, well, let me get one more, and then we'll see what else. Oh, go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
Robbie just gave you the title for your book tour in every city. It could be let's go back to the Bible, because that's indeed at that school board or wherever. Let's go back to the Bible. The problem with white evangelical is the term that defines the phrase is not evangelical. The term that defines the phrase is white. So all the big lie stuff we hear about the election, underneath the big lie is the bigger lie of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And the bigger lie of white supremacy is fueling the whole movement now about voting rights and the rest. So Jesus said, again, back to what Jesus said, you'll know the truth and the truth will make you free. Mm-hmm. So if we're gonna trying to stamp out the truth of the history of white supremacy, that keeps all of us in that kind of bondage. Mm-hmm. And so I think wherever, Texas or wherever, going back to the Bible and having a biblical conversation is the way through these political conversations. Mm-hmm. Because people don't want to deal with what the Bible says. So we can't just stay political with them left and right. Don't go left, don't go right, go deeper, I always say. Well, what you've done here in the book is you've given a biblical foundation. You're not just being critical of right-wing evangelicals. You're saying, here's what the Bible says. You're saying what you're for and what you believe and how you want to live, not just who you're against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what is not the case. What it really comes down to is it's revealed that they value their own desires much more than they value the biblical witness that they claim to be guided by. I mean, and it's so glaring. I've tried to make it even more glaring, you know, with regard to homosexuality in the book, and the treatment of Muslims and Mexicans, and even unions. You know, they're folk who just are living a lie, and it has nothing to do with, and they do it in the name of their faith, and it has nothing to do with their faith. And in a sense, that's anti-Christian. One might call that an antichrist movement, right? I mean, that's what I call it, antichrist movement. It's a movement of antichrist, and we have to deal with that way. It's heretical, it's blasphemous, it's destructive. But on the other hand, I wanted to say, and then I will let you all go on, is that I realize that there are many people who subscribe to this who are abjectly wrong, but they are sincerely wrong. They have taken the word of their deceptive leaders, and they think they're doing the right thing, and you know, try to address them and respect them. You know?
Yeah. Obery, I'm gonna jump to two quick questions because I think they're kind of close to my own, you know, heart
Sharon's
too.
been
And you
trying
know,
to get.
oh, sorry. You know, jump in
Sharon's been
first.
trying to get in.
Do that. Yes, sorry. Yes, good.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Obery. I mean, I think I just wanted to say, I think that part of the responding to this whole part of the conversation, I think that at the heart of the issue is that I wonder if the European church at large has ever really known brown Jesus.
Hmm.
I mean, really, like ever really known brown colonized indigenous Jesus.
In his own context.
In his context,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, his political context. And so because of that, you have the entire Christian faith, like not entire, the Western Christian faith that for thousands of years now, or for at least 1,000 years, has been shaped in the halls of empire.
Yes.
So that orthodoxy has been set in the halls of empire. Who's that going to benefit?
Yeah.
It's going to benefit. So then why wouldn't they gravitate towards Trump, who is promising empire?
Mm.
So I think that the question that I'm left with, and I hope we do talk about a little bit, and I want to hear from you, I want to hear from everybody actually, is what's it going to take to save the faith? I mean, not just the church, but the faith. Because quite honestly, you know, Jim, you said earlier, young people are going to stream away from the church. They already have.
Yeah.
It's
sure.
done. It's gone. Like they're done. They're not there anymore.
Right.
And so what does that say to the next generation? Literally, the next generation of moms and dads that are growing up their kids right now, they are not growing them up in church.
That's right. That's
They're
right.
not.
Yeah.
So what does that say about our society and the moral foundations, and how are we going to find our center?
Mhm.
And when they come back to the church, if they come back to the church, or even if they come back to Jesus, which Jesus are they coming to?
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good point. You know, and that's why, if you might recall from my book, Politics of Jesus, and in this book as well, I've always stressed the ethical and the moral content of the teaching, because that's what Jesus stressed. You know, we don't have any evidence that no evidence that he was conscious of starting a new religion, not at all. And in fact, you know, he said he came to fulfill Judaism, and you know, he didn't tell people to worship him. He told people to follow him. And you know, his disciples, we forget that disciples are students. And when he said, go out and make disciples of all nations, he said, go out and make students, teachings, take my teachings out. And so I think if we can stress the teachings and the foundational teachings of the Hebrew Bible, you know, again, you know, folk can resonate, you know, with that. I will tell you, one of the biggest thrills I've gotten is that I got a tweet during the Ferguson uprising that a pastor out there, young pastor, Starsky Wilson, who's now, you know, the head of
the Children's Defense Fund.
Head of the Children's Defense Fund, and that he was giving out copies of Politics of Jesus to protesters,
Wow.
and that's the kind of thing that we have to do. Now I know you and Jim have been out in the street, out in the field, quite a bit, and that's what we're going to have to do. We have to preach with our feet. But I guess what I'm suggesting is what's most important is the moral and ethical content of his message than talking about him as a person and a personality, and that's another level of discussion.
Yeah. Robbie's got a question he's dying to get to, but just in response to this, the good news, Lisa, is I find the kids or young people leaving the church. They are all over the place, and most of my classes at Georgetown, they come to class on faith, race, and politics, but none of them are actively involved in any, but they're there because they're interested in more than just politics. This is why they're not just all going to Marxism and anarchism. On the contrary, they know there's got to be a spirituality of social change. And they're still drawn to the Jesus stuff. They're still drawn to the Bible. They're at Ferguson, we found Brittany Packnett found her faith again in the streets.
Yeah. Like
a lot of millennials, she had left her religious background and so on, but she found it again in the streets. So the good news for me is all these people who are being drawn to social justice, but they're being drawn to something deeper than just secular movements. I mean,
that's true.
I got kicked out of my evangelical church as a teenage kid over the issue of race, and I found myself in the movements of my time, and I explored Marxism and anarchism, but I chose Jesus over that. I left that to choose Jesus because the Marxism and anarchism finally weren't satisfying to me. So a real secular reaction to the church isn't what I see happening. I see people who are being drawn. That's why your book, we should pass it out to a lot of these young people, whether they're in church or not, because they're going to be drawn to the Bible that you're talking about, the biblical texts, the Jesus gospel, the Hebrews. That's what they're going to be drawn to. My classes, that's what they're drawn to. They might not want to affiliate with the church. That they're none of the above, meaning their affiliation. They don't want to affiliate, but they're drawn to the core of what you're talking about in your book, which is what I'm very hopeful about, a new generation. They want a faith or a spirituality or something that they can't even quite name, but they're drawn to what you're talking about in your book.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Spirituality, but to me, the gospel is the spirit. Part of the spirituality of the gospel is its politicality, right?
Right.
And, so love your Lord, your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but love your neighbor as yourself. And and where those two meet is this holistic spirituality,
that's right.
And that's what moves Jesus, right? But what moved him, of course, again, was the moral and ethical witness, right? So I think we're saying the same thing, Jim. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Robbie, you got a question you've been begging to put out there.
Yeah, I just want to, we're getting lots of really good comments in the Q&A. I want to reflect, there's a number of people, Obery, saying, thank you, this conversation, and Jim and Lisa too, thank you, this conversation is giving me hope. So I just want to kind of reflect that back to everyone. I think that's notable. One question, I've got some thoughts on this, Obery, but I want to hear your thoughts here from someone saying, to what extent is this movement of this kind of distorted funhouse mirror version of Christianity that right-wing evangelicals have constructed, how are they impacted by their declining numbers? As you know, we put out a new study just last week showing that white evangelicals have declined from being 21% of the population to 14.5% of the population in just a little more than a decade. And white Christians as a whole now only make up 44% of the country, compared to 54% when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, right? So it's a broad white Christian decline, and evangelicals are actually leading the decline, the most precipitous free fall. is among white evangelicals. 2 million members the Southern Baptist Convention alone has lost over the last decade. So to what extent do you think that context, that sense of decline, is playing in what we've seen playing out over the last 4 years, and I think even ramping up today? Like, how much of a factor is that?
Yeah, I'd be interested in your conclusions, but I think it's causing a great sense of I think there's a great sense of fear and desperation that they're feeling now. They're feeling a sense of loss, right? Pat Buchanan talked about how in 2040, more than half of the nation, whites would make up less than half the nation and population, and how that would mean the end of civilization and all that. I think that maybe they don't think that, but they do see it as being the end of their domination. And these are people who are not looking at others as equal neighbors, right? They're looking at them as and I think also I think that many of the whites and their fear of the true history of the country being taught, I think that that those who fear, it seems like they think that others are going to demonize them the way that they've demonized others. It's like they think that everybody is like them and everybody's going to act the way that they act. And I think that's really significant, because white supremacy holds itself up as the ideal, as close to human perfection as possible. And so if they are the prototype of humanity, or the archetype of humanity, that then they expect others to act the same way. And I think that's causing a great fear. So what's pushing them is fear and desperation of losing their status in society, that they will be treated by Black and brown people the way that they have treated Black and brown people. And and we know desperation makes, the more desperate a person gets, the more dangerous they are. And so this is a real sign of extraordinary danger on the horizon that we have to be aware of, I think.
Thanks. One other question, Obery, that is a little different. So someone asking about the ways that this mindset, maybe even the spirit of the Antichrist that you're talking about has found some fertile ground even among Black and brown people. In Africa, the African diaspora, this is what the question is asking, and what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, well, we're talking about white supremacist, imperialist Christian hegemony. It's very successful. Some of the most politically, theologically conservative Christians are on the African continent, right? And it just shows how successful imperialism, ideological imperialism, continues, to be. People buy into this stuff, and that's the only explanation that I know. It's not because it all makes more sense, but it does. It goes back to white people's ice is colder. Even though all ice has the same temperature, it's like, no, I'll take that white man's ice. It's just, I don't know, it just seems colder, and it comes down to that. And it's sad, and it's dangerous. And they will fight to the death, sometimes harder than whites will, to advance white supremacy, just to show that they belong. A la Clarence Thomas. Oh, did I say that? I didn't say that.
Yes, you did. Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I just have a thought here. I've been to Brazil and South Africa and have thought a lot about this question, knowing that the majority of the churches that have been planted in the Southern Church have been planted by Southern Baptists or PCA, basically conservative white evangelical churches. it is their fervor for missions that actually has planted these churches around the world. And that was on the heels of colonization. So colonization crumbled, and on the heels of that came the Southern Baptist Church to then open up the church and teach them about white Jesus, about white imperial Jesus. And so I think that this is a conundrum, but you don't, what I see is, I see in South Africa a different story. I see that in spaces where you have had revolution and rebellion against the powers, like actual rebellion against the powers in nonviolent ways and according to the scripture, you actually do have here in the US with the civil rights movement, in South Africa with the anti-apartheid movement, you have a sense of, I too possess the image of God, in a way that many other nations don't have that, because they've never had that movement. They've never actually had the leaders to actually, or in India's case with Gandhi, to say, we are children of God. We do not need to drink the white man's tea in order to, we have our own tea in order to enjoy this life in this world. I'm not sure where that leaves us, except to say that it's not a given that wherever the gospel goes, it's going to be a white man's gospel.
It's also, I think, important for us to understand everything isn't just about religion. Things are often about power. Even in South Africa, where I'm deeply discipled by South Africa, the economic power structure is still controlled by the old people to a large extent. And here, a lot of the black and brown votes going Trump were particularly, well, more black men than women and more Hispanic men than Hispanic women, and going for the economic prosperity and the promises that Trump made. And so Heather McGee, in her wonderful book, I'll recommend another book here, Some of Us, Heather points out the stupidity of white racism, where after the civil rights movement was passed in '64, there are 2,000 public swimming pools that closed down because whites, this is middle class, lower class whites, don't want to swim with black people. They're still closed down, like cemented and dirt in the pools. The rich people all had their own pools and still do, right? But there's a power structure, and that power structure is still a white power structure. Right. And even you know, why are we having so much trouble with West Virginia, full of a lot of low-income white people? Because it's not even the self-interest, it's the hate. People are, when you appeal to fear, which leads to hate, which leads to violence. It's not even in the self-interest of the families of those white people. It's about evil. Appealing to fear and hatred and violence as a whole. The insurrection on January 6th is not over. It's not over, and a whole lot of armed people are out there. And when you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff chair talking about Reichstag moments and Nazis and brown shirts, there's a thing out there in this country. I'll just say, I'll be blunt. January 6th, those people were the lynchers. They were the lynchers. And the crowds cheering the lynchers and the lynchings. And all across the country, evangelical leaders that I know and talk to are deeply agonizing over some of their people in the Capitol. And in that movement, we're facing a real power struggle here. This isn't just about religion and the future of young people in our churches, it's about power. And so that, and you know, and the gospel, as Obery points out, the scriptures are full of, the word oppression didn't come from Karl Marx. The Hebrew prophets talked about, you know, it's not just poverty just happens, it's oppression. You know, the reasons for poverty are oppression, the way society's organized and structured, and who's in charge.
Economic violence.
Economic violence. And I had a meeting with a Black faculty member at Georgetown yesterday. We talked about how that, You know, even in the Black community, racial democracy has got to be linked with economic democracy.
Yeah.
And it often isn't, you know. So there's often that linkage, racial economic democracy. And Obery, you've laid that out so powerfully your whole career and your whole life. But this book lays it out. This is a biblical foundation, a gospel foundation for the kind of democracy, racial and economic, that we're fighting for its life right now in this country. So these issues are more than about the churches and who's in them and all that. It's about power and how our lives are going to be lived. So I just can't recommend this book enough to those who are listening today.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim, Lisa, and Obery. We're almost at time. I'm gonna give you the last word though here to wrap it up. There's a ton of appreciative comments about giving people, you know, this conversation in your book, giving people hope. And I certainly found that in my reading of it too. But let me just kind of hand it over to you to, you know, take us out here at the end.
Well, I thank you, Robbie. And again, I'd like to thank you all of you. I say this to your face, and I'd say it behind your back. All of you are. I respect you very, very deeply. All the great work that you do. And Robbie, you know what you're bringing to light, you know, the information, the analysis you bring to light is so very important. Not to mention your books. So you know, all three of you are activists par excellence in your own lane, and now Jim has a distinguished chair in a distinguished university. So, you know, he can go there and make good trouble there too. So thank you all so much. I just like to say that, you know, I'm thankful for the appreciation the book is getting, because, I wrote it for, you know, for a number of reasons, and some of them we've talked about, but one was I wanted to give sort of a standard or baseline for prescription and analysis, you know, to how do we, you know, how should we prescribe, how should we write policies? What policies should we be supporting? You know, what kind of criteria should we use? I tried to offer that in my chapter explaining the depth of social egalitarian social justice as the baseline, the foundational baseline of biblical ethics and morality, but also as a tool, an analytical tool as well, to analyze what's going on, you know, to analyze the various policies that are extant and that are being proposed. You know, that's something that you know, all of us know it is not enough is being done with that. Example for me is that when Barack Obama first offered the Affordable Care Act, he initially talked about it as a function of his faith, and then somehow he pivoted, and he lost the moral high ground, and they've been savaging him ever since, because he took, you know, he pivoted to take a political stance. Well, you know, and I'm not criticizing it. What I'm suggesting though is that it is a lesson in what not to do. It's that when we take a moral stand based on, in this country that claims to be a Christian country, and we show how our stances, our ethical and deeply moral and deeply faith-infused positions, how they are anchored in an informed reading of the biblical text, that gives us a very strong foundation to stand on when we argue with those in the corridors of power, and when we argue with the charlatans out there who are talking like Ted Cruz and creeps like that. And then I said that, you know, who try to act like they're supporting some kind of faith. Well, we know that they're not, and we have to do more work to discredit what they're saying, not to discredit them personally, because they do that to themselves, but just, to discredit the lies that they're spreading on the gospel and of Jesus Christ. And lastly, I said that my main concern is not the church, but the church is so very important in so many ways. In my introduction, you saw that. I talked about the how important it was in my life and all that the Black church does, the important sense of community and empathy and the sense of self that it gives. And sometimes it's the only place that Black folk can be somebody, and so for Black people, it's extremely important. So I'm not down on the church. And so one of the other reasons I've written the book is to try to defend the church, right? And to show the importance of, and we have to do that because the problem is not that young people are leaving the church as an institution as much as it is they are leaving some very important ethical and moral teachings that have been a lamp unto the feet of some of the greatest people in this country. And then one has to wonder, well, if they jettison this, then what are they putting their energy into? And so those are the things I would share, and that's really, those are some of the burning issues in my heart when I wrote the book. And I want to thank you all so much for your attention and for the support that you've given me. And in the words of the old Black church, I feel like going on.
Amen. All right, well, here's the book. Oh, there it is. Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. And thank you, Obery. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Jim, for being here. And thank you for the gift of this book, Obery. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. And this will be up. We'll record it, so we'll have it up and post it out publicly tomorrow.
Well,
Bless
thank
you
you
all.
all. Thank you. God bless everybody. And struggle on, folks. Struggle on.
Go on together. We're going
That's
together.
right. That's right.
Thank you, Obery. Thank you,
Amen.
Robert,
Bless you.
Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.